I mean that literally. I kept a tally for the first 8 months. Scratch marks on a load-bearing column down in what we call Section D, the deep part of the structure, where the ceiling is low, and it always smells like wet clay no matter how much lime we pack into the walls. 8 months of marks. 4 vertical lines and a diagonal. 4 and a diagonal, over and over until I got to roughly 240. And then I just stopped. Not because things were better, not because things were worse. I stopped because I realized counting was its own kind of damage. Every mark said, "You didn't expect to be here this long." Every mark was a little surrender, dressed up as discipline. So, no more counting. I know it's been 2 years because of seasons, and because Garrett's kid, the one Bev delivered down here in the 3rd month, the boy nobody thought would make it because he came early, and we had no real medical equipment. He's walking now. Talking. Calls me something that sounds like Dex, even though that isn't my name. My name is Derek, but kids don't care about that, and neither do I anymore. My name is Derek Paulson. Before all this, I was a structural and civil engineer. 12 years in the field, mostly commercial construction, a few infrastructure contracts. I spent the last 3 years before the outbreak doing subsurface work, parking structures, utility tunnels, underground transit extensions. That last job is why I'm alive. That last job is why 73 other people are alive. I'm going to explain what we built here and how we built it. And then I'm going to explain what started going wrong 3 weeks ago. Because if whoever's listening to this is coming in from outside, you need to understand the full picture before you walk through our gate. You need to know what this place cost. But first, the morning. I wake up at 5 every day. Not because anyone makes me. Not because there's an alarm. We have a few battery-powered clocks, but I stopped relying on them months ago. They drift. I wake up at 5 because 2 years of the same schedule has wired my body to it, the way a dog gets wired to its feeding time, and I'm not insulted by that comparison. Dogs are practical. Dogs adapted. Dogs are still alive. The bunk I sleep on is a frame I welded together from rebar and shelf supports. With a mattress I dragged through 3 blocks of open street on the back of a wheeled equipment cart back in month 4. Twin size. The foam is starting to break down on one side, so I rotate it every few weeks, sleeping head to foot when I rotate, which means sometimes I spend the night looking at the junction box on the wall, and sometimes I spend it looking at the curtain I hung in the doorway of my room. It's not a room exactly, more like a partitioned section of what used to be a utility corridor before we expanded the wall framing and ran electrical through it. I've got about 90 square feet. I've got a shelf I built from scrap lumber and deck screws. I've got a folding chair. I've got a hook on the wall where I hang my work vest. A canvas thing with a lot of pockets, all of them worn soft now. And a second hook where I hang my belt. And on that belt is a hatchet and a fixed blade knife and a small LED flashlight that I recharge off our solar bank every 3rd day. I don't sleep with the hatchet on. You'd think after 2 years that would feel normal, sleeping armed. For some of the team, especially the younger ones who came in after the 1st year, it does feel normal. For me, it still doesn't. When I take that belt off at night, I feel the specific relief of a person setting something down that is genuinely heavy in more than the physical sense. And when I put it back on in the morning, I feel the opposite of relief, but I put it on. Every morning. 5 o'clock. I pull on my jeans. I've got 2 pairs, both patched at the knees, and a thermal undershirt and the canvas vest, and I go out through the curtain and walk the 12 feet down the corridor to the main junction, which is where 3 different tunnel sections branch off, and where we've set up what Nate calls the kitchen, though it's really just a propane double burner on a concrete work platform and a series of shelves made from cinder blocks and plywood, holding our dry goods in sealed buckets. 5-gallon plastic buckets with rubber seal lids. We've got probably 400 of them, in various states of fullness, spread between the kitchen section and the 2 storage vaults down in Section B. This morning, like most mornings, Owen is already there. Owen Briggs. He's 61, which makes him the oldest person in the structure by about 4 years. Before the outbreak, he drove a school bus, and before that, he'd done 20 years in the Army, which you would not know by looking at him, because he's 5'8", and walks with a slight limp from a knee replacement he got in 2019. What you would know by watching him is that he is the kind of man who can sit completely still in a dim underground corridor at 5 in the morning and drink instant coffee from a tin cup and not seem uncomfortable at all. Not performing patience. Actually patient. "You sleep?" he asks, which is his standard greeting. "Enough," I say, which is my standard answer. He pours me a cup from the small pot he's already heated, and I take it and lean against the wall, and we stand there for a while without talking. This is important, I think. The morning quiet. We protect it as much as we protect the gate. The structure is 63 feet below street level, at its deepest point, which is Section D, where the old scratch marks are. The main living areas are between 30 and 45 feet down. We've got 3 ventilation shafts bringing in outside air. I designed a passive system with baffled inlets that keeps noise and light from escaping upward, which was the first real engineering challenge I solved here, back when it was just me and 5 other people trying not to die. And those shafts keep the air from getting stale, but they don't keep it warm. In winter, it's cold down here. Not dangerous cold, not hypothermia cold, but the damp kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays. People complain about it. I tell them it's consistent, which is more than the outside offers. At 5:30, I do my walkthrough. I check every section every morning before anyone else is up. I look at the walls, the ceiling, the floor joints. I look at the support columns. We've got 22 structural columns in the main living areas, poured concrete with rebar cores, and I know every one of them the way a dentist knows teeth. I check the electrical runs along the ceiling. I check the gate systems, which are 2 layers of reinforced steel doors at the main entry, operated by a hand crank mechanism I engineered from a modified truck winch. I check the secondary exits, 3 of them, all disguised at the surface level, all alarmed with wire trigger systems that ring a bell down in the junction if disturbed. I check Section C, which is where we keep the children and their parents. 21 kids right now, ranging from Garrett's boy who's 2 to a 15-year-old girl named Holly who came in alone 6 months ago and who has never told any of us how she spent the time between the outbreak and her arrival, and whose hands are steadier than most adults when she's holding a tool. I don't push her on it. I check the medical area, which Irene runs. Irene Schwartz, 53, former ER nurse. She keeps her section clean, in a way that would be impressive anywhere, and is particularly impressive 60 feet underground with limited supplies. She's the reason our infection rate, infection meaning wound infection, not the other kind, has stayed manageable. She uses diluted bleach for surface disinfection. She uses pressure dressings made from cut fabric when we run low on commercial bandages. She tracks everything in a notebook with cramped handwriting I've never been able to read. I check the water room, which is where our 2 collection cisterns sit. Rainwater through the surface inlets, filtered through a gravel and charcoal system I built in month 7 after we had 3 people get sick from the early unfiltered supply. We boil before drinking, always. The cisterns hold about 800 gallons combined when full, and we try to keep them above 600. Below 500 and I start getting anxious. By 6 o'clock I've done the full circuit, and I'm back at the junction with a list in my head of the 3 or 4 things that need attention that day. This morning it's, check the mortar joint on column 7, where I saw a hairline crack starting last week, replace the wiring on the Section A secondary alarm which has been intermittent, and talk to Nate about the ventilation duct in the east shaft that's been making a low hum when the wind is from the northwest. That last one matters more than it sounds. Noise discipline is our first line of survival, always has been. Let me back up. Let me tell you how this started. Not the outbreak. I'm not going to waste your time on that. You know how the outbreak started. Everybody knows their own version of how it started. The news reports, the theories, the 14 hours of increasingly insane information before the internet went down in stages, like lights going out in a house, where somebody's cutting the power room by room. You know all that. Your version of it probably sounds a lot like mine. I'll tell you how I specifically got here. I was on a job site. Of course I was. That's where I spent most of my life. The site was a subsurface parking structure, being built under a new mixed-use development on the east side of the city, about 8 blocks from where the fortress entrance is now. 3 levels of underground parking, 60,000 square feet per level, cast-in-place concrete, with post-tension slab construction. We were about 60% complete. The lower 2 levels were fully poured and cured. The 3rd level was poured, but still had equipment and formwork in place, and the surface building above was in steel framing, nowhere near enclosed. I had 22 workers on site that morning. It was a Tuesday. I remember, because I was annoyed about the Tuesday specifically. We'd had a concrete pour scheduled for the Monday that got pushed due to a material delivery issue, and I'd had to reschedule my entire week. And I was standing in the lower level in my hard hat and steel toes, doing the kind of slow burn that a delayed pour produces in a man who has been doing this long enough to know that delays compound. The radio chatter started around 9:15. My crew foreman, his name was Hal, I'll come back to Hal, had a weather radio he kept in the cab of the site crane because he was particular about that kind of thing. The chatter on the AM band was already strange by 9:15, which means it must have been happening in some form much earlier, and we just hadn't caught it yet, because we were underground with limited signal. When Hal brought the radio down to me at the bottom of the access ramp, the sound coming out of it was already past the point of making sense. Not the usual emergency broadcast cadence, something more fractured, people talking over each other on what sounded like a public safety frequency. A woman's voice saying something about Riverside and not going outside. A man's voice saying a number that I think was a casualty count, but the signal broke up. The emergency tone, that familiar electronic shriek, going off and then stopping midway through, and then starting again. I looked at Hal, and Hal looked at me. Hal was 54. His whole face was a map of 25 years in construction. Sun damage, a scar from a formwork accident, the particular squint of a man who has spent a lot of his life looking up at things against a bright sky. He was not a man who got rattled easily. I had seen him direct a crane lift in a windstorm without raising his voice. I had seen him handle an OSHA inspector visit with the specific blend of cooperation and oblique deflection that experienced foremen develop over decades. He looked rattled. "That's not a drill," he said. "No," I said, "it's not." We spent about 20 minutes trying to get more information. Phones started failing around 9:30. The cellular networks jammed up almost simultaneously, the way they always do in a real emergency. Everybody trying to call at once, and the system folding under the load. I got one call through to my girlfriend at the time, a woman named Diane who worked downtown in an office building, and she picked up and the first thing she said was, "Derek, there are people on the street and something is wrong with them." And then the call dropped and I never reached her again. That's not the part of the story I'm going to dwell on, because dwelling on it doesn't do anything useful, and because I've had 2 years to sit with it, and I know what I know, and I've put it in the place where it needs to stay. But I'm telling you it happened so you understand that I made the decisions I made that day as a person with a specific hole in his chest that hadn't existed 20 minutes earlier. That matters to how the decisions got made. What I did was, I made my workers go underground. All 22 of them. I walked the site. I found every man who was working above grade, and I told them to come down. Some of them resisted. One guy, young kid named Tyler, maybe 22, said he needed to check on his mother, and I told him I understood that, and I wasn't going to physically stop him from leaving, but I was telling him right now that going up was a mistake. He left. I never saw him again, and I don't think about what that means, because I know what it means. The others came down. We pulled the main site gates closed, heavy chain link with a sliding latch, and I had 3 guys push a concrete bucket over to block it from the inside, and then I stood at the bottom of the ramp and listened to the city coming apart above me. It started as sound. That's how things start when you're underground. You hear things in a way that's oddly flat and directional, like sound coming through a tube, and what I heard in those first hours was sirens that started and then stopped. Car impacts. You learn to identify that sound, the specific crunch and scrape of it. Screaming, occasionally, which your brain at first processes as just another urban sound. The way you learn to tune out horns and arguments, until it gets close enough that you can't tune it out anymore. Breaking glass at intervals. And underneath all of that, consistent and irregular at the same time, a sound I didn't have a word for yet. It's a sound I know now, intimately. The sound of the dead when they're moving in numbers. Not the individual shuffle you get with a single stray one, but the collective murmur of a group of them when they're all pressing in the same direction. It's almost like an ocean sound, a white noise of dragging feet and occasional low vocalizations. Not words, not attempts at words, just air moving through damaged vocal apparatus. When there are enough of them in an enclosed street, it sounds like wind through bad weather stripping. The first night was the worst and the longest. We had no supplies beyond what happened to be on the site. 2 half cases of water bottles in the foreman trailer, a cooler with construction crew lunches that some of the guys hadn't eaten yet, a first aid kit, basic tools obviously, and a lot of concrete and rebar and heavy equipment. We ate what we had and rationed the water. And in the morning, I told everyone what I thought was happening and what I thought we should do about it. 3 men left the next morning. I couldn't stop them, and I didn't try. That left 19 of us. 19 people in an unfinished underground parking structure, with the city going silent overhead, in the specific way that cities go silent after something catastrophic. Not peaceful silence, just the absence of the ordinary sounds that you took for granted for your entire life, and didn't know you were taking for granted until they stopped. The second day I started making a list. Not of days, of what we had and what we needed. Materials inventory, structural assessment, ventilation capacity, water access. There was a utility connection in the lower level that still had pressure for the first week before the city systems failed. Power. The site had a generator that could run off diesel, and we had 2 full tanks of diesel on site, which I rationed ferociously from the first moment. Exits, access points, and how to secure them. Engineering problems. That's what they were. That's how I looked at them. Because if you look at them any other way, if you let yourself look at the full scope of the situation in human terms, 19 scared people underground in a city that has just ended, you will stop functioning. I know, because on the 3rd night I let myself do exactly that. I just lay there on a folded tarp, thinking about Diane and what the world looked like 3 days ago, and whether any of this was real. And I lost probably 6 hours of productive thinking. 6 hours I needed. So after that I stayed in engineering mode. It has served me every day since. The structure we're in now is not only the parking garage I was building, that was the seed of it. Over the first 2 months, working with whoever I had, and the number shifted constantly early on, people arriving, a few leaving, 2 deaths in that first awful period, I extended the footprint of the fortress by connecting to an adjacent storm drainage system that ran beneath the street to the north. The drainage tunnels were old infrastructure. Pre-war concrete, low clearance but solid. I shored them up, raised the floor in a critical section where water used to pool, and broke through a wall at the junction point to create a second wing of habitable space. By month 3, we had roughly 12,000 square feet of usable underground area. Not all of it was nice. Most of it was rough concrete and darkness and the smell of old earth. But it was secure. I will tell you exactly how I built the gate system, because people always ask about the gate, and it's a point of pride in the specific way that only practical solutions produce pride. Not the look what I made satisfaction, but the oh good it works satisfaction, which is quieter and lasts longer. The main entry is through what looks, from the surface, like a basement utility access for the retail building that was supposed to go above the parking structure. The building was never finished. It's now a concrete shell with half its steel framing still exposed. But the utility access was built, and it has a heavy steel door that originally had a commercial lock. I replaced the lock mechanism with a custom bar and bracket system, using steel I harvested from leftover formwork hardware. From the outside, it looks locked in a normal way. From the inside, it can be secured with 2 separate bar locks that would require cutting equipment to defeat quickly. Beyond that door is a stairwell down 20 feet to the first security vestibule, a section of the original parking structure access corridor where I added a second door. This one reinforced with plate steel I welded to the face of a standard commercial door frame. Between the 2 doors is a space of about 15 feet that I think of as the airlock, a place where you can admit someone and assess them before letting them any further in. The outer door can be operated from below via the truck winch cable system. Somebody can be admitted, the outer door closed behind them, And then before the inner door is opened, the vestibule is viewable through a steel-framed observation port in the inner door. This has saved lives. It has also cost lives, in the early period, when we got it wrong, when we were too slow with the assessment, and someone standing in the vestibule was compromised, and we had to make decisions about the inner door that I don't enjoy thinking about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The water system I mentioned, the cisterns, the charcoal filter. By month 4, I'd also added a second collection inlet on the east face of the building above, running a concealed pipe through the foundation wall to a secondary cistern in what is now the Section B storage area. More collection surface, more redundancy. Engineering principles. You never design with single-point failure if you can avoid it. Power is our most limited resource, and has been from the beginning. The generator ran for the first 4 months on rationed diesel. When the diesel ran out, I shut it down permanently. I didn't want a machine that was useless creating false dependency, and I converted everything critical to battery and solar. We've got 8 solar panels on the roof of the shell building above, concealed within the structural steel, so they're not obvious from street level, running wire down through conduit in the building's framing into a bank of deep cycle batteries in Section C's secondary room. The battery bank runs our lights, which are all LED strips using very low wattage, and the charge controller for the panels, and the communication radio on the second level of the main entry. We are careful about the radio. Sending signals is how people find you. Finding can go 2 ways. The food. Let me talk about the food, because it's probably what you're most worried about if you've been outside. The first year, we relied heavily on what we could retrieve from the surface. This was always the most dangerous part of survival, and it still is. But in the first year, it was almost impossibly risky, because we didn't know the patterns yet. We didn't know where concentrations of infected were, how they moved, what triggered them to cluster versus disperse. What I had was engineering intuition, and a crew of people with varied skills. Among my original 19 construction workers, I had a man named Floyd, who had done electrical work before he transitioned to general labor. I had a guy named Cody, who was 26, and had the specific fearlessness of a young man who hasn't yet been truly damaged by something. I had Hal, who had done construction in 3 different cities and knew how urban infrastructure worked at a practical level, where things were, how buildings connected to service routes, where supply depots usually sat relative to commercial districts. We did our first surface run at night on day 8. 4 of us, me, Hal, Cody, and a guy named Pete who was 40, and built like someone had assembled him from spare machine parts, all angles and leverage. We went out through the secondary exit, a maintenance hatch that opened into a utility easement behind the shell building, in an alley narrow enough that you could walk it in 2 steps. We went to the nearest grocery distribution outlet, which was a wholesale warehouse 3 blocks away, because Hal knew about it from a previous job that had been near there. The warehouse had been broken into, obviously. But wholesale warehouses are not like grocery stores. They're not designed for easy consumer access. The goods are on pallet racks at heights of 15 to 20 feet, and a lot of people who came through in those first chaotic days didn't know what they were looking at. We found 3 intact pallets of canned goods in the back section of the rack that nobody had touched because they required a pallet jack to reach. A pallet jack that was still sitting right there on the warehouse floor because nobody had thought to use it. Canned beans, canned tomatoes, canned corn, canned fruit and syrup, commercial catering cans, the big number 10 size, about 150 of them. We brought what we could on the first run and went back 2 more times over the following week. That was the moment I understood something important. The people who had ransacked places like that grocery store on the corner, the places that were obviously full of food, they'd stripped them down to nothing. But infrastructure people, people who moved goods for a living, had organized their supplies differently. And most people didn't think like supply chain people. They thought like panicking consumers. So I started thinking like supply chain. We've done runs, over 2 years, to 4 different food distribution facilities, 2 commercial warehouse spaces, a restaurant supply company, a hospital nutrition service depot that nobody found for 11 months because it was in the basement of a medical building that looked, from the outside, like it had already burned. It hadn't burned. The first floor had. The basement was fine. We have, right now, approximately a 3-month food supply for 73 people stored in sections B and D. That's not comfortable. Ideally, I want 6 months. But it is stable, and it's what we have. I track every calorie in and out. I keep a ledger. It's boring, meticulous work, and it's probably why we're alive. We also grow food, which I want to be honest about in the sense that what we grow does not and cannot sustain us alone. We've got a hydroponic setup in Section A, using water from the cisterns, and LED grow lights from the battery bank. Greens mostly, some peppers, some herbs. It supplements. It provides vitamins we otherwise wouldn't get. It matters. But if the external supply runs stop tomorrow, we would be in serious trouble within 90 days. This is why the night hunts matter. I need to explain what I mean by hunting because I suspect, if you're new, you're picturing something more dramatic than it actually is. Less drama, more maintenance. The thing about infected concentrations is that they're like weeds. You don't get one massive dramatic moment of victory over them. You get constant, ongoing clearance work. Stop doing the clearance work, and they accumulate the way brush accumulates around a building, slowly, and then all at once. And by the time you notice you have a problem that's difficult to manage. The team I run is 8 people. We go out every night unless the weather is too bad for safe operation. We operate in a 2-mile radius from the fortress entrance. I'll introduce the team because they matter to what happened 3 weeks ago. Owen, who you've already met. He doesn't do close work anymore because of the knee, but he's the best navigator we have, and he's calm in a way that keeps other people calm, which is worth more than physical capability in most situations. Nate Heller, 34. He was a high school chemistry teacher, which sounds useless and turned out to be extremely useful. He's got a scientific approach to problems that complements my engineering brain. I think in structures and loads, he thinks in systems and processes. He's also one of the best close-quarters fighters on the team, which he is embarrassed about but shouldn't be. He uses a modified entrenching tool, a standard military E-tool with the blade sharpened to an edge that makes me uncomfortable just watching him sharpen it. He's efficient. He doesn't narrate it. He just does what needs doing and moves on. Garrett Flynn, 41. He had a landscaping business before. He knows the streets in our operational radius better than anyone because he worked them for years, doing residential maintenance in this neighborhood. He knows which yards have fences, which alleys connect to what, where the drainage low spots are that collect water and attract infected during wet weather. His knowledge is the kind that you can't create from a map. It's a lived spatial understanding, and it has saved us at least 3 times. Liam, 20 years old. Last name I'm going to leave out because he asked me to, and I respect that. He's got fast twitch reflexes in a way that's almost uncomfortable to watch. He moves in a crisis the way some people move during sports, without the thought lag that most of us have. He doesn't sleep well, and he eats too little, and I worry about him in the background way that I worry about a lot of things, the low-level sustained worry that has replaced the acute terror of the first few months. He uses a machete, which is not my preference for the noise risk, but he handles it in a way that eliminates the noise problem. Becca Marsh, 27. She was a physical therapist. She joined us in month 4, came in through the main gate alone with a duffel bag and a compound fracture on her left forearm that she'd splinted herself. Irene set the bone. Becca spent 3 weeks in recovery, and during those 3 weeks, she learned everything about the structure and the team, and by the time she was operational, she knew more about the system than people who'd been here twice as long. She's a quick study, and she has what I'd call applied intelligence. Not theoretical, not abstract, just immediate and practical. On the team, she handles overwatch and communication, running a walkie-talkie relay that keeps us in contact across our operating range. Cal Hooper, 52. Career firefighter, retired 3 years before the outbreak. He's steady the way Owen is steady, but in a more physical sense. Owen is steady in his thinking. Cal is steady in his body, in his movements, in the way he never seems to rush or panic, even when rushing would seem warranted. He uses a fire axe that he carries on a back sling. When people see it, they sometimes assume it's about emotion, about aggression, about the cultural weight of axes. It's not. It's just effective. And it's what he knows. And Cal is a man who uses what he knows. And Roy Dunn, 48. I have to think about how to describe Roy. Roy worked in insurance before all this. Claims adjustment. He spent 20 years visiting damaged properties, assessing what had gone wrong, calculating what things were worth, and what it would cost to make them right. He has a specific and powerful ability to look at a broken or compromised thing and understand immediately what failed and why. On a structural or mechanical problem, I'd call this an engineering eye. In Roy's case, it's something more general. He sees failure. He tracks it. He anticipates it before it's visible to everyone else. He also hasn't smiled in 2 years. I don't think this is grief. I think it's his natural state, which the current environment has made look like grief from the outside. He's not depressed. He's just built differently than people who smile a lot. Roy is the one who first noticed the pattern change. I want to tell you about a normal night run before I tell you about the abnormal one, because the contrast matters. We go out at 10, always 10. The reason is practical. By 10, the streets have been dark for long enough that any infected that were attracted to late-day ambient noise have had time to wander off in whatever direction they were going. The hour between 9 and 10 is actually our most dangerous window, and we don't operate in it. We've tried going earlier, in the first year, and 2 of those early runs turned into extremely close situations. 10 is safer. We don't use lights on the way out. None. 0. We've all done this enough that we can navigate the 2-block surface route from the secondary exit to the first operating zone in absolute darkness, by memory, and by the particular texture of the pavement under our feet. I know that sounds extreme. It took about 3 months to get there. Now it's just the way we move. The secondary exit opens into the utility easement. The easement runs north-south, about 4 feet wide, between the Shell building's east wall and an adjacent commercial property that's been empty since before the outbreak. We go north on the easement to the point where it meets a service road that runs behind the whole block, and then we assess from there. Assessing means stop, listen, breathe through your mouth, slower, quieter than through the nose. Scan the available sight lines. Give it 2 full minutes. 2 minutes of stillness and listening tells you more than a flashlight sweep, because what we're listening for is not a visual thing, it's acoustic. The dead make sounds that are subtle enough that people miss them at first. A soft, rhythmic shuffling. Occasional contact with surface objects, a foot dragging against a curb lip, a shoulder brushing a chain-link fence. The low, wet sound that their breathing makes, which is not like human breathing. It's more irregular, and it has a quality of effort to it that human breathing at rest doesn't have. You also listen for the absence of other sounds. Rats, birds, insects. The urban wildlife that adapted surprisingly well to the outbreak conditions. They go quiet around infected concentrations, the way they go quiet before weather. This is not something I read in a book. This is something Garrett noticed in month 2, and which has turned out to be consistently true. After the 2-minute assessment, we move. We work in pairs. Owen and Becca handle communication and stay at the secondary exit staging point, maintaining radio contact and watching the return route. The remaining 6 split into 3 pairs. Nate and Garrett, Liam and Cal, me and Roy. The pairs operate on preset routes that I plan every week, based on what we observed the previous week, and any intelligence from daytime observation through the ventilation shaft cameras. I rigged 2 small cameras to the vent outlets about 8 months ago, running wire down the shafts to a small monitor in the junction. The cameras have limited angle and limited range, but they show me the street in front of the Shell building and the service road entrance, and I watch them for 30 minutes every morning after my walkthrough. On a normal night, each pair covers their route, clears what needs clearing, and returns inside within 3 hours. The clearing is systematic, not frantic. We're not heroes. We're not trying to save the world. We're removing accumulations of infected from the specific zones that create risk for the fortress if allowed to build. Think of it like pest control, which is a dark thought that I had once, and then felt bad about for about a day, and then filed under practical reality. The method varies by situation. When it's a single infected in open space, and we have clearance, Liam is usually fastest. When it's a group of 2 or 3, We work split distraction. One person creates a subtle directional sound, a small stone tossed against a surface, a hand slap on a metal surface to draw attention. And when the infected move toward it, the second person comes from behind. When it's a larger group, we avoid direct engagement if possible, and use the route to lead them away from our zone, toward natural containment features in the area, fenced lots, cul-de-sacs, low structures they'll wander into and mill around in. The dead don't have strategy. That's the one consistent advantage we have. They respond to stimulus. Sound, primarily. Movement at close range. Once in a while light, though their visual response is slower and less reliable than their audio response. They don't plan ahead. They don't learn from experience. They don't coordinate. They're drawn individually toward inputs, and they happen to end up in the same places because the same inputs attract all of them, which creates the appearance of coordination but isn't. It's convergence, not cooperation. 2 years of observing them has given me a model of their behavior that is, I think, reasonably accurate. A single infected will wander in relatively straight lines, correcting slightly based on auditory input, until it's drawn to something. Once drawn to something, a sound source, a noise, movement, it moves toward it, and keeps moving, until either it reaches the source or loses the stimulus. If it reaches a non-viable stimulus, a piece of debris that made a noise once and stopped, say, it will mill for a while, sometimes minutes, sometimes longer. Then the general wandering resumes. Groups of infected form because wandering individuals converge on the same stimuli. The group doesn't communicate. There's no leadership, no designated role. What you get is a crowd of individuals all responding to the same input, and therefore all moving in the same direction, which from a distance looks like coordinated behavior, and from up close is clearly anything but. This model has served us well for 2 years. 3 weeks ago it stopped being accurate. It was a Wednesday night. I remember because Roy mentioned it. Wednesday, he said, for no reason. Just sort of noting the day the way people do sometimes, when the day seems to have a character to it. I have no idea why Wednesday, but that's what it was. We were on our 3rd hour out, late in the run. Liam and Cal were already cycling back. Nate and Garrett had reported clean on their north sector. Roy and I were finishing the east block, which runs along a section of the commercial corridor that had a lot of small retail before. The kind of block with a dry cleaner and a pharmacy, and a place that sold phone cases, all compressed together, all dark now, all with broken front windows, and 2 years of leaf debris blown against the door frames. There was a group of 7 infected about 60 yards ahead of us. 7 is not unusual. 7 in this block specifically I've seen before. What was unusual was their position. They were stopped. Now, stopped infected is not new. They stop when their stimulus stops. They mill. What I mean by stopped is something more specific. They were arranged. And I want to be careful with that word, because arranged implies intent, and I'm not saying intent. They were arranged in a rough semicircle facing the same direction. East. Down the block, toward the old parking structure entrance, about 400 yards from our position. And they were stationary, not milling, not the characteristic slow shuffling that you see when they're in a low-stimulus environment, completely still. Roy put his hand on my arm. He didn't say anything. We watched for 30 seconds. They didn't move. I've seen infected stop because they've detected something, a small sound ahead of them, an input drawing their attention. In that case, you get tightening. The group contracts as individuals all orient toward the same point, and the ones in front might take a step or two. This was different. These were spread out, not contracted, and facing in the same direction without taking any steps. That's not right, Roy said, at a volume I could barely hear with my ear next to his head. No, I said. We held position for another 2 minutes. They didn't move. I watched for any external stimulus that might explain the behavior. Any sound, any light source, any movement in the area they were facing. There was nothing I could identify. Then, the one on the far left of the group turned its head. Just the head. The body didn't move. The head rotated. Slow, irregular. Not a human neck movement. more like a machine with loose tolerances. And for a moment, it was facing roughly in our direction. And in that moment, I felt the specific fear that is not general animal fear, but the precise sharp fear of being seen. Even though we were 60 yards away and in shadow and had made no sound, even though everything in my 2-year model said it couldn't have detected us from this distance in this light, it turned back. "We're leaving," I said. Not a question. Roy didn't argue. We backed out of the block slowly, keeping to the wall line, and made it to the staging point where Owen and Becca were waiting. I told them what we'd seen. Owen's expression didn't change. Becca's did. She frowned in the specific concentrated way she frowns when she's processing a problem. "7?" she said. 7. Grouped like that and not moving. Like that. We went inside. I sat at the junction with Owen and Becca and Roy until 2 in the morning, talking through what it could mean. We came up with 6 possible explanations, ranging from something unusual in their immediate environment, a smell, a low-frequency vibration from underground infrastructure, to more concerning possibilities. We didn't arrive at anything definitive, and eventually we slept. I noted it in the operations log and told myself we'd see what the next nights brought. The next night, Garrett and Nate reported a similar grouping on the north sector, 5 infected, positioned along the fence line of a commercial parking lot, facing the same general direction as the previous group. East, still not milling. The night after, Roy and I went specifically back to the east block. The group of 7 was gone, dispersed presumably. But Roy found something on the pavement in the area where they'd been standing. He crouched down in the dark and ran his fingers over it. "Come here," he said. I came. He pointed. In the beam of my carefully shielded flashlight, I had 2 fingers over the lens, letting out just enough light to see up close. There was a damp patch on the pavement, roughly oval, dark. Roy touched it with 1 finger and showed me his finger. "Not blood," he said. "No," I agreed. It wasn't the right color, and it didn't smell like blood. It was something I didn't immediately recognize. Slightly viscous, an unpleasant smell, organic, but not the specific rot smell of the dead. "Animal?" I said. Roy thought about it. "Maybe." He said it the way you say maybe, when you don't actually think it's a maybe. Night 5, after the first sighting. All 3 pairs out, Nate and Garrett on north, Liam and Cal on west, Roy and me on east. About 45 minutes in, Becca comes on the radio. She's at the staging point doing overwatch, and her voice is very level in the way that it gets when she's working to keep it level. "East pair, stop moving." We stopped. "I've got a visual on a group of 9, 30 meters north of your position. They're moving, but..." A pause. "Derek, they're moving in a line." Roy and I looked at each other in the dark. "A line," I said, on the radio. "Single file," Becca said. 7 or 8 feet between each one, moving east. They just passed Clement Avenue. I knew Clement Avenue. Clement Avenue was 4 blocks from the fortress entrance. East of Clement, the infected in our operational zone would normally be moving away from us, not toward us. Single file, moving east. "Do you copy?" Becca said. "I copy," I said. "Pull Nate and Garrett to your position. Keep Liam and Cal in place until I say. Roy and I are going to follow this group. Derek, we'll stay back. 40 meters minimum. I need to see where they're going." A breath on the radio. "Copy." Roy and I tracked the group for 6 blocks. 40 meters back. Both of us moving along the building line on the south side of the street. The group, 9 infected, as Becca said. Moving in something that wasn't quite a line but wasn't the usual shapeless cluster either. Moved with a consistency of direction that I had never observed before. When an infected in the middle of the group drifted left toward a noise from that direction, it self-corrected. It came back to the general heading. Not because anything drew it back, it just came back. That doesn't happen. An infected that detects a stimulus goes toward it. That's the rule. It doesn't self-correct. It doesn't maintain a group heading in the presence of competing stimuli. The behavioral model I'd built, the one I'd used to keep 73 people alive for 2 years, said this was impossible. I put that thought somewhere useful and kept following. They led us to a section of the commercial corridor I knew, but we'd stopped running as part of our regular route about 6 months back, the eastern edge of our operational zone. There was a cluster of larger commercial buildings there, a mid-rise storage facility, a defunct automotive shop, a building I'd identified early on as a former distribution center for a regional grocery chain. The distribution center. They were going to the distribution center. Roy touched my arm again. He pointed. I looked up. On the roof of the building, just at the parapet line, there was a faint glow. Almost nothing. If you weren't already looking up, you'd miss it entirely. But we were looking up because the infected had led us here. And led us here meant someone put them here to lead us here. And someone here meant light. There are people in that building, Roy said. Yes, I said. They know we're following. Maybe, maybe not. I think maybe yes, Roy said, very quietly. I looked at the 9 infected, who had reached the building's loading dock and were now milling against the dock door, not going through it, not attracted into it. Whatever was pulling them had stopped. They were just there, in the low stimulus state, shuffling in small circles. The dock door was closed. Someone let them mill here on purpose, I said, and then cut whatever was drawing them. Roy thought about it. Signal of some kind. Sound, below our hearing. Maybe. I thought about the damp patch on the pavement. Or a scent. Roy was quiet. If I had access to industrial pheromone compounds, I said, thinking out loud, a thing Roy tolerates from me, though I'm not sure everyone on the team would, or certain animal attractants, the right chemical signature in an aerosol or a slow-release device, I could potentially influence where infected clustered. It wouldn't be precise control, but it could be directional influence. Roy looked at the infected at the loading dock. They'd been drawing them here. Or away from there, I said. East. East meant away from us. Away from the fortress. Roy turned to look at me. In the dark, his face was a collection of shapes I'd learned to read without being able to see the details. They've been pushing infected in our direction. Or they've been pulling them away from their own location, and we happen to be in the path of dispersal. You're giving a lot of benefit of the doubt to people we didn't know existed an hour ago. I'm trying to understand the mechanism before I decide on the response, I said. Roy made a small sound that was not agreement or disagreement. He looked back at the building. There's someone up there, he said. Yes. Someone who's been affecting our operational environment for at least 3 weeks without telling us. Yes. What do you want to do? I thought about it for a long moment, listening to the milling infected at the loading dock, watching the faint glow at the parapet line. I want to know who they are, I said, before anything else. Not just the night crew, everyone. Or the closest thing to everyone as I could get at midnight. I sent Liam to wake Owen, who woke Cal, who woke Nate, and we met in the junction, and I laid it out. The grouped infected, the single-file movement, the distribution center, the light at the parapet. 20 minutes of people talking over each other until I put my hand up. Here's what I know, I said. There's a survivor group in the distribution center to the east. They have a method of influencing infected behavior. I don't know the mechanism yet. That's one of the things I need to find out. Their method has been creating an effect in our operational zone that we've been observing for 3 weeks without understanding it. Whether they know we exist, I can't say yet. Whether they've been doing this in ways that have directly created risk for us, that is something I need to assess. They've been sending infected in our direction, Liam said. I don't know that that's accurate, I said. Derek. Liam is one of the few people on the team who calls me by name in a way that has impatience in it. He's 20, and it comes from a genuine place, so I don't correct it. 9 infected walking in a line toward our block, led by whatever signal this group is using. That's a direct risk. If the signal is pulling infected toward their building from all directions, and our area is to the east of them, then we're receiving the runoff of their operation. That's a side effect. It's not the same as intentionally targeting us. Intentional or not, same result. The response changes based on which one it is, I said. So I need to know which one it is. Garrett, who had been quiet, said, How many, do we think? Unknown. Could be 6 people. Could be 60. Yes. If it's 60, he didn't finish. If it's 60, we're not going to solve this with a direct confrontation, I said, which is why we gather information before anything else. Owen spoke up from the back of the group, where he'd been leaning against the wall with his coffee cup. There's another possibility nobody's mentioned. Everyone looked at him. They know you're there, he said, and they've been choosing not to contact you. That's a position, means something, one way or another. The room was quiet. How do you want to make contact? Owen said. I had been thinking about this on the walk back. Daylight approach. Small team. 2 people, maximum. We approach the building from the north face, not the loading dock. We make our presence known from a distance before we get close. We give them every opportunity to respond before we advance. And if they don't want to respond, Roy said, then we learn something. The next morning I went through my walkthrough. Fixed the mortar joint on column 7. The crack was superficial, surface shrinkage, not structural. And then I spent 2 hours going through everything I could remember, and everything Nate could help me reconstruct about the chemistry of pheromone and olfactory-based animal behavior management. Nate dug through the collection of books and printed documents we'd accumulated over 2 years. There are about 300 of them in the Section A reference room, pulled from offices and libraries on various supply runs, and came back with 2 pages of handwritten notes. Scent-based herding has been used in agricultural contexts, he said. There are commercial products, synthetic fear pheromones, stress hormones, designed for livestock management. If you wanted to apply it to infected, you'd need to determine whether their olfactory processing is functional, and the evidence suggests it is. They respond to organic scent in clear ways. The patch on the pavement, I said, consistent with a slow-release delivery mechanism, something that would dissipate over hours. You place it at specific intervals along the path you want them to follow. They detect it and follow the scent gradient. Could you make something like that? Nate looked at the ceiling for a long moment, the way he does when he's running internal calculations. Possibly. With the right source materials, I'd need something high in certain ketone compounds, acetone-adjacent chemicals, maybe some sulfur-bearing compounds. The kind of thing you'd find in industrial cleaning supplies or certain agricultural products. The distribution center, I said. Regional grocery chain. They'd have both. Nate nodded slowly. Someone in that building figured this out. They've got the supplies and they figured it out. That's not a stupid group, I said. No, that's a chemist or a biologist or someone with very good applied instincts. I wrote that down. Filed it in the part of my brain that was building a profile. The contact approach happened the following afternoon. I took Roy because Roy is the person I trust most to maintain composure in an unpredictable situation. We went out through the secondary exit in the mid-afternoon, which we almost never do. Daylight surface movement is a different kind of risk than nighttime. You're visible at range, which is both a danger and, in this case, an intention. We went east. We moved carefully, using the service road and the rear easements where possible. 45 minutes to cover what should be a 10-minute walk, because careful. We approached the distribution center from the north face as planned, staying on the far side of the parking lot, about 200 feet from the building. I stood there, in the open, in daylight. Roy 2 steps behind me and to my left, both of us with hands visible. I waited. For 3 minutes, nothing. Then, a figure appeared on the building's roof, parapet level, same position as the faint glow the night before, standing still, looking at us. I raised one hand, not a wave, just a raised hand, acknowledging. The figure didn't move. A minute passed. Then a second figure appeared, this one at ground level. A door I hadn't noticed on the north face opened, a steel service door, and a person stepped out. She was about 30. Medium height, a canvas jacket with the collar turned up. Her hair was in a low bun, and she had what I can only describe as the walk of someone who has decided to be unconcerned, even when they aren't. She crossed about 30 feet of parking lot and then stopped. We looked at each other. You've been following my markers, she said, not accusing, just stating. Your markers have been directing infected into our operational zone, I said, not accusing. Just stating. She looked at me for a moment. Your operational zone. We have a secured area to the west. We run nightly patrols to keep infected concentrations down. Your pheromone gradients have been disrupting the pattern we've established. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise. More like recalculation. You're the people in the construction shell, she said. Yes. We thought that was abandoned. Roy, from behind me. We work at that. Her name was Dot, short for Dorothy, which she volunteered with the specific preemptive energy of someone who is always correcting the assumption. She was the closest thing the distribution center group had to a leader, though she described it as less formal than that. We make decisions together, she said, which sounded good, and I'd already heard it from 6 different survivor groups, and had learned that it usually meant one person is making most of the decisions, but wants the moral cover of saying otherwise. There were 31 people in the distribution center. They'd been there for 8 months. Before the distribution center, they'd been in a community center about 2 miles north, which had failed for reasons Dot described in a compressed way that told me there was more to the story that she didn't want to get into. Standard. Every survivor group has a story they don't want to get into about how they ended up where they ended up. The pheromone system was her work. Her background was veterinary pharmacology. She'd worked in a research context, not clinical, and she had the particular working knowledge of chemical biology that comes from spending years figuring out how animal nervous systems respond to specific compounds. When she came to the distribution center, she'd found the grocery chain's agricultural supply stock, cleaning agents, pest management products, a small inventory of agricultural inputs from a retail partnership program the chain had run with local farms. She'd spent 4 months developing the system. It wasn't designed to affect anyone else, she said. We were standing in the parking lot. The person on the roof was still up there, watching. We use it to move concentrations away from our perimeter. The dominant gradient draws them east, and then the secondary marker at the dock disperses them back into a holding cluster. The holding cluster being, Roy said, approximately 6 blocks from our entrance. Dot looked at him, then at me. I didn't know there was anyone there. I know, I said. The question now is what we do about it. She thought about it. What do you want to do about it? I'd like to understand your full system before I answer that. Because if you've got something that can direct infected movement with the consistency you've apparently achieved, that changes a lot of our calculus. She studied me for a moment. I could see her running the same kind of assessment I was running. What kind of person is this? What do they want? Are they a threat? Can I afford to trust them? The evaluation that every survivor has to run constantly, and that none of us are ever quite sure we're running accurately. Come inside, she said. Roy and I exchanged a glance. Tomorrow, I said. Daytime. I'll bring 2 more people. She nodded. We'll be ready. I want to tell you about what happened the night between that first meeting and the second visit, because it's where the situation stopped being a puzzle and became something else. We were doing our standard patrol. About 11:30. All 3 pairs out. The night had been clean. Unusually clean, actually. Fewer infected contacts than we'd had in weeks, which I noted and filed. Becca had a count of 2 isolated individuals in the northern sector and 0 in the east block, which was where Roy and I had been concentrating. At 11:42, Liam came on the radio. Derek! West sector. Something's wrong. The west sector is the area I'm least worried about on a normal night. It's the far side of our radius, and it's bounded by a natural feature, a series of collapsed buildings from a gas explosion in the first weeks of the outbreak that created a rubble field that infected can't navigate effectively. It's been our quietest direction. Define wrong, I said. A pause. There are a lot of them. They're in the lot by the old garage. I don't know how many. Too many to count. I looked at Roy. Roy's jaw moved slightly, the way it does when he's doing math. Liam, what's the count estimate? Best guess. 30, 40 maybe. Derek, they're not moving. We moved to the west sector. Double time, staying low. By the time we got there, 5 minutes, there were more. 50, maybe 60 infected in the parking lot of a decommissioned auto garage 4 blocks from the fortress entrance, packed in a space that could theoretically hold 3 times that many. All of them stationary, facing west. Roy put his mouth very close to my ear. Something drew them here. Something still drawing them. The distribution center is east, I said, very quietly. Whatever Dot's system is putting out, it's not pulling them this way. No. I had been assuming Dot's system was the only one operating in our area. That was the assumption I should have questioned first, and I didn't. And that oversight is the kind of thing that will keep a person awake at night for the foreseeable future. There's something else running, I said. Roy looked at the infected mass in the parking lot. 60 or more, motionless, packed together. Or someone adjusted her system without her knowing. We need to get inside, I said. Agreed. We pulled everyone back to the staging point. 6 people, plus Owen and Becca, fast and quiet, back down the easement and through the secondary exit. I sealed the door and stood in the stairwell, with my heart moving at a rate it hadn't moved at in several months, and thought very carefully about what I knew. What I knew, Dot's system had been pushing infected east. The group I'd just seen was packed in a lot, 4 blocks from our entrance, on the west side of our position, the opposite direction from Dot's influence. Either Dot's system had reversed, or there was a second system, operating independently, pushing from the east. Pushing from the east meant pushing toward us. I got on the radio. Becca and Owen were inside. I went to the junction and put both of them in front of me and said what I thought was happening. Owen finished his coffee. When did you tell her you were coming back tomorrow? Today. We arranged it today. Owen nodded very slowly, not indicating that this meant anything specific, just processing. I'd still go, he said. So would I said, but I'd add someone. I added 2 people actually. Nate because of the chemistry knowledge, and Liam because if something went sideways, I wanted Liam's reflexes available. The 4 of us went east at 10 the next morning. Daylight again. The night's infected accumulation on the west lot had dispersed by dawn. We checked through the cameras first, and Garrett confirmed on a quick pre-dawn scout. So the immediate crisis had passed. But the west lot residue told me something was developing, and I needed to understand it before it developed further. The distribution center's north face door opened before we reached it. Dot was there with 2 other people. A large, quiet man named Todd, who turned out to be her de facto security, and a thin, older man named Glenn, who she introduced as her chemist, because she had one, which I'd suspected from the sophistication of what she'd built. We sat in the distribution center's office section, a row of management offices off the main warehouse floor, cleared and set up with folding chairs and a large table. The warehouse itself was impressive in a practical way, organized, well lit by daylight through the skylights, with rows of shelving still holding the kind of bulk supplies that a regional grocery distribution point would have. Nate was visibly calculating the food volume. I was calculating the people, because 31 people in a space this size with this much supply was a situation of relative abundance, which created its own kind of politics. I told Dot about the west lot, about the 60-plus infected, motionless, facing west, about the fact that something had been operating from the east. She didn't look surprised. I noticed that. Someone's been interfering with our markers, Glenn said, before Dot could respond. He was 60-something, small, with the particular nervousness of someone who spends most of his time thinking and not enough time dealing with other people. We noticed 2 weeks ago, the secondary marker at the dock was being countered, something else in the chemical mix. It was disrupting the gradient. Countered, I said. Overridden, he corrected himself. Someone added a competing compound to the mixture, at the source point, which means someone accessed the source point. Where is the source point? I said. On our dock, Dot said, very flat. Someone accessed our building. I let that sit for a moment, then, and you didn't tell us. We didn't know you existed. You've known for 3 days. She looked at me. Her jaw was set in the way that people's jaws get when they're deciding how much to concede. We weren't sure what you were. And now? Now I'm sitting here, so make of that what you want. Nate said, is the interference ongoing? Glenn, we replaced the source compound yesterday morning and added a new delivery point as backup. The gradient to the east should be re-establishing. But whatever was counteracting it, We haven't identified it. You have a chemical intruder, Roy said, from the corner where he'd positioned himself and had been watching the room, who knows enough about your system to add a specific counteragent. That's not a random person. That's someone with knowledge of the system. Dot and Glenn looked at each other. Someone here, Roy said, not a question. We've had 2 groups arrive in the past month, Dot said carefully. A family of 4 and a group of 6. You've vetted them, I said. As well as we can. How's that? We talked to them, watched them. They had children in the family of 4, which, she stopped. Which made you more willing to trust them, I said. It's a reasonable heuristic. It's the one people exploit. She looked at me. Something shifted in her expression that I recognized as the specific expression of someone being told something they already suspected, but hadn't let themselves say out loud. The group of 6, Todd said, from near the door. He'd been silent for 20 minutes. They wanted access to the loading dock for storage. And they got it, Roy said. Nobody disputed that. Who are they? I asked. They said they came from the north, a community called the Shepherd's House, a church or compound of some kind. They were vague about the specifics. 6 people, 3 men, 2 women, 1, Dot paused, 1 child, about 8 years old. The specific pause before 1 child was a thing I heard. I didn't press it. Where are they now? I said. They're in the building, 2nd level. I looked at Roy. Roy looked at the door. Todd caught the look and moved slightly. Not dramatically, just a shift in his weight distribution that said he'd noticed the same thing I noticed, which was that this conversation was already more complicated than anyone in the room had expected it to be. I'd like to meet them, I said. I'd like some time, Dot said. I don't think time is the thing we have a lot of, right now. They weren't there. The 2nd level, when Todd went to check, was empty. The group of 6 had their belongings still there. Bedding, a few personal items, some supplies they'd brought, but the people were gone. Todd came back and said so, and the atmosphere in the room changed in the specific way that atmospheres change when a clear and present problem takes shape from something previously abstract. When were they last seen? I said. Yesterday evening, Glenn said. Dinner. I stood up. Then they've had 14 hours. Nate, can you assess the dock situation, the compound source point, see if anything's been touched in the past 12 to 14 hours? Nate was already moving. Todd, I said, I need a map of this building. Every entrance, every exit, every access point to the roof and the exterior. Todd looked at Dot. Dot looked at me. You're moving fast, she said. Last night, 60 infected were parked in our operational zone pointing at our entrance, I said. This morning, the people who were interfering with your system have disappeared. I'm moving appropriately. A moment. Then Dot nodded to Todd. The building had 4 exterior exits and 2 roof access points. Nate found the dock source point disturbed. Glenn's replacement compound had been partially removed and replaced with a different substance, which Nate described in chemical terms I won't fully reproduce, but which Glenn, when he heard it, called a reversal agent that would push the gradient west, toward us. They're not redirecting infected around your building, I said to Dot. They're trying to use your system to direct a mass of infected at ours. She stared at me. They've been building up a concentration on our west side for at least several nights, I said. And now, they've adjusted your source point to push the gradient in the right direction to break whatever containment pattern they've established there. Why? She said. The word came out flat and slightly hollow, which is the way why comes out when someone can already see the answer and doesn't want it. Your building, I said. Your supply inventory. If we're under siege and our capacity is destroyed, anyone looking for resources in this area has fewer obstacles between themselves and you. She sat back in her chair. Or, I said, because Roy's point about benefit of the doubt from a week ago was still with me. Someone in the Shepherd's House group has a directive from a larger organization that wants this whole area denied to other survivor communities. Territory control without direct confrontation, which is a rational strategy if you have the resources to run pheromone operations, but not the numbers for a straight fight. Either way, Roy said, they're not in the building anymore. And whatever they started last night, they're either going to let run or they're going to escalate. I looked at Dot. We have a fort 45 minutes west, 63 feet underground, reinforced gate system, capacity for more people than we currently have. If this building gets compromised, we're not going anywhere, she said. Dot. 31 people. Most of them have been here 8 months. We're not leaving our supplies. I understood that. Completely. Okay. Then let me tell you what I think is going to happen in the next 12 hours. What I thought would happen. What I told them clearly. The Shepherd's House group, or whoever sent them, had established a pheromone gradient that was accumulating infected in our western zone. They'd adjusted Dot's system to begin pushing the existing eastern concentrations west as well. The net effect, over several hours, was convergence. Infected from both directions being drawn toward the same zone, which was the area between the distribution center and the fortress. The objective, as best I could read it, was to overwhelm our clearing capacity, create a siege condition, and then either wait for us to be eliminated or approach to rescue survivors, taking control of resources in the process. The flaw in this plan, and it was a real flaw, was that they'd underestimated what we'd built. They were treating the fortress as a surface structure, the way most survivor shelters are. Surface structures can be sieged. You can surround them, starve them, wait. You cannot effectively siege an underground structure with 3 disguised exits and an 800-gallon water supply and 4 months of food. What you can do is make leaving it nearly impossible, which is different but still serious. How long do we have? Liam asked. He'd been quiet through most of the discussion, just listening with his arms crossed and his weight shifted to his right foot in the way he stands when he's ready to move quickly. The gradient from the east was altered 14 hours ago, Nate said. With the concentration that was already on the west side and the directional influence from Dot's modified source point, if the original pattern holds, we're probably looking at significant accumulation within 6 to 8 hours. So tonight, Liam said. Tonight, I said. Dot said, what do you need from us? Your chemical knowledge, I said. Glenn, if you can create a dispersal agent, something that breaks the gradient, pushes infected away from both buildings, how long would that take? Glenn thought about it carefully. 6 hours, maybe 8. We don't have 8. What can you do in 4? A partial compound. It won't be stable. It'll work for a few hours. Good enough. Liam was already looking at me. We need to get back. Yes. Nate said. There's one more thing. He'd been quiet for a moment, and his tone had the particular character it takes when he's about to say something he's been holding. The child. He looked at Dot. You said the Shepherd's House group had a child, an 8-year-old. Yes. Where did the group go? Because if they've released 6 adults into an area that's about to become a high-density infected zone, the child, Dot said, understanding immediately. If the child is with them, Nate said, they're not going to leave the area, not with what's coming. They'll need somewhere to go. Dot put her hands flat on the table and looked at them. We'll monitor our roof, if we see anyone. They might not be alone when they come back, Roy said. The group may have grown, or they may come with other people from wherever they came from. That's a lot of uncertainty, Todd said, from the door. Yes, I said, it is. We went back at 1 in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, which was good for surface movement. Diffuse light, no hard shadows, nothing that catches and holds the attention of an infected, the way direct sun on a moving surface can. We moved fast. I pushed the pace harder than I usually would, and nobody complained. At the fortress entrance, I went in and immediately called an all hands in the main junction. Every adult in the structure, 39 people when you excluded the children, and the 3 who were too ill or physically limited to be in the discussion usefully. I stood at the front of the group and laid it out. No softening, no management language. I'm not that kind of leader, and these aren't that kind of people. We're going to have a significant infected concentration in our operational zone tonight. Estimated arrival time, 6 to 8 hours. I want every team in position by 9 o'clock. Secondary exits, sealed and alarmed. The main gate will be secured at 8:30. Garrett, I want you and Floyd to do a full check of the alarm system on all 3 secondary exits this afternoon. Now, as soon as we're done here. Owen, I need you coordinating communication from the junction. Becca will be at her station. Surface team is me, Roy, Nate, Cal, Liam. We're going to run a modified patrol. Our objective is not clearing, it's monitoring. And we're going to implement a dispersal strategy I'll brief you on when Nate has worked it through. What's the dispersal strategy? Garrett asked. We're getting help from the distribution center group. They have a chemical approach to infected movement that we're going to use to push back against the gradient that's been established. It's not a guarantee, but it changes the math. You trust these people, Garrett said. It wasn't quite a question. I trust that their interests align with ours tonight. Whether that extends beyond tonight is something we'll assess. Garrett nodded. He's a man who understands practical calculus. I sent everyone to their tasks. The next 4 hours were controlled chaos of the productive kind. The kind of chaos that is actually just concentrated preparation, where everything looks frantic and is actually proceeding according to a plan. Garrett and Floyd on the alarm system. Irene setting up the medical area for potential casualties. Holly, the 15-year-old who I'd been teaching mechanical systems to for the past 4 months, running electrical checks on the battery bank and the gate mechanisms. Cody, who'd been one of my original 19 construction workers, and who I trusted completely on structural and hardware tasks, inspecting every weld on the inner gate door. I went to Section D and sat for 10 minutes. I don't meditate, exactly. It's more that I go quiet in a particular way before something serious happens. I focus on the specific engineering problems ahead of me. I run through the scenarios. I identify the failure points, the points where the plan assumes things go a certain way and where reality might diverge. I think through the alternatives to each assumption. The assumption that worried me most, that the dispersal agent Glenn was preparing, would work as expected. The assumption that worried me second most, that the Shepherd's House group had no further moves to make. The assumption that worried me third most, that I knew where all the infected in our operational zone were, and what drew them. 3 weeks ago, I thought I had a complete model. I was wrong. I needed to hold my current picture of the situation with appropriate humility. The assumption that worried me fourth, that Garrett's check of the secondary exits would come back clean. It didn't. Garrett found me in the junction at 3:15, with the specific look on his face that 30 years of landscaping and 2 years of underground living had compressed into a single expression. Trouble confirmed. East Secondary, he said. The wire on the alarm trigger's been cut. I felt something cold move through my chest. Not fear exactly, more like the physical sensation of a plan, changing shape under your hands. Cut or broke, I said. Cut, clean cut, tool. How recently? Floyd says the wire has some oxidation. Not yesterday, maybe a week ago. I stood very still for a moment. The east secondary exit, I said. Where does it come out? Behind the old insurance building on Prospect, about a block and a half from the Clement Avenue intersection, which was the intersection where Becca had first reported the single-file infected moving east, 4 blocks from the distribution center. The Shepherd's House group hadn't found our secondary exit by accident. They'd been in and out for at least a week. The wire cut alarm meant they knew about the secondary exit and had deliberately disabled our notification system, which meant they'd been inside the fortress access corridor. Did they come all the way in? I said. Garrett's expression shifted slightly. There's debris at the bottom of the stairwell. Boot prints in the dust. How far? They stopped at the inner door, the one at the lower landing. The lower landing door, the heavy steel inner door to the living section, the one Cody had welded from plate steel. My door, the one that would require cutting equipment to defeat quickly. They'd been there. They'd looked at the door. They hadn't tried to come through it. Yet. Get Cody, I said. I want additional steel on the frame of that door. Bracing bars. Whatever he can do in the next 3 hours. Floyd, add a secondary mechanical alarm at the top of the east secondary stairwell. A trip wire at ankle height. Something they'll hit if they come down in the dark. I want redundancy on that detection. That means going outside, Garrett said, meaning the top of the secondary stairwell, which opened to the surface. Yes. Take Liam, and do it fast. Get it done by 5 o'clock. Garrett was already moving. I stood in the junction and thought about the child, 8 years old, whoever it was, wherever they were, and about what kind of people bring a child to this kind of operation. Two things that didn't fit together cleanly, but they rarely do. Nate came back to me at 4:30 with the dispersal plan. I need to explain the plan not because the chemistry details are important for you to know, but because the spatial logic of it is, and the spatial logic is what made the night work. The infected were, by our best estimate, accumulating in 2 zones. The western lot, where we'd seen the big group 2 nights ago, and a secondary zone developing along the Clement corridor, as the modified gradient from Dot's system continued to push them from the east. The area between those 2 zones was roughly our main operational block, the streets immediately surrounding the fortress entrance. If both zones continued to build and then the gradient reversed or collapsed, which it would, eventually, because the artificial gradient is sustained by the source compound and source compounds degrade, the 2 groups would disperse in roughly random directions. Random directions from those 2 start points meant some percentage of them would converge on us. The dispersal agent Glenn had prepared, and which Nate had evaluated and partially modified, because Glenn wasn't working with full information about the specific compounds in the Shepherd's House counteragent, and Nate had figured out what those were, would not clear the infected. It would create an olfactory gradient that infected respond to in a way analogous to aversion. Not a fear response exactly. There's no evidence the dead experience fear in any functional sense, but a navigational avoidance. They move away from it the way any animal moves away from a compound that registers as noxious at a neurological level. Our plan was to create an avoidance corridor between the 2 accumulation zones, a chemical barrier of sorts. If it worked, the 2 groups would push outward from their current positions, rather than inward toward each other, and toward us. The delivery mechanism, Nate said. That's the problem. Glenn uses slow-release surface deposits, stable over 12 hours. But we don't have 12 hours. We need something faster. What are the options? Aerosol. But we'd need to cover a significant amount of linear distance, maybe 300 meters of street corridor. Aerosol in the volume we'd need would require equipment we don't have. What if we don't need full coverage? I said. What if we create nodes instead of a continuous barrier? High concentration points at interval. If the spacing is right, Nate said, picking up the thread immediately the way he does when he thinks the idea has legs, the individual aversion zones might overlap enough to create an effective corridor without full coverage. But the spacing has to be precise. Too far apart and infected will move between the nodes. How far apart? Based on the typical dispersal radius of a volatile organic compound at this temperature. He did some calculation in his notebook. 40 to 50 feet. We'd need 7 or 8 nodes across the 300-meter stretch. That's 7 or 8 people placing containers under field conditions with infected in the zone. Yes. Tonight. Yes. I thought about my team. 7 active people plus Overwatch. 7 nodes. 2 people needed for each node placement due to the conditions. That was more people than I had. The distribution center team, I said. They'd need to be briefed and placed. They're already briefed. I'll take Todd and 2 others. That puts us at, I counted, 8 deployers, 2 Overwatch pairs, and Owen on internal coordination. Nate nodded. We'd need to move fast once we start. If infected detect the first node before we've placed all 8, the movement disturbance could collapse the plan. How fast? 20 minutes to place all 8 nodes from start of operation. That's about 2.5 minutes per node. Possible, I said. Tight, he said. Most things that matter are, I said. The radio call to the distribution center went through at 5:30. Becca handled it. We'd established a channel code with Todd before we'd left that afternoon. He answered immediately, which told me they'd been listening. I explained the node plan to Todd. He listened without interrupting, which is the listening posture of someone who either trusts you or is making a rapid internal assessment and needs the full picture before they have a response. When I finished, he said, "When do you need us there?" 9 o'clock. 2 people from your team plus yourself. Come to the east secondary exit. I'll have someone there to meet you. We'll be there, he said. Todd. Yeah. The child. From the shepherd's house group. Is there any sign of them? A pause. No. Dot sent 2 people out this afternoon to look. Nothing. I had an idea about where they might be, and it wasn't a good idea. Okay. We'll work the problem as we find it. At 9 o'clock, everything converged. Todd arrived with 2 people from the distribution center. A young man named Finn who moved like someone with military training. He didn't volunteer this and I didn't ask, because sometimes you don't need the history. And a woman named Bev, who turned out to be the distribution center's version of me, a person with a construction background who had ended up managing the physical maintenance of a survival structure and had learned about 100 adjacent skills in the process. She and I spent about 30 seconds establishing mutual recognition the way construction people do. A shorthand conversation about load paths and water management that told each of us the other knew what they were talking about. And then we were operational. I briefed the full team at the junction. Everyone who was going out. Me, Roy, Nate, Cal, Liam, Todd, Finn, Bev, Owen on internal, Becca and Garrett on overwatch. Node positions are here, I said, showing the sketch Nate had prepared. Specific points on the 300-meter corridor between the 2 accumulation zones. Each node is a sealed glass jar. We've got 8 of them, prepared and labeled. You pick up your node at the start of the run. You go to your position. You break the seal and set the jar open end down in the indicated location. You do not linger. You move to the extraction route immediately. The full operation has a 20-minute window. If you are not at the extraction point in 22 minutes, we are not waiting. Nobody argued with that. They knew what it meant and why it was necessary. What's the current infected situation? Roy asked. Becca's last count was approximately 40 in the west accumulation zone, I said. The Clement corridor has an estimated 20 to 25. That gives us a combined count of 65 in the operational area. The gradient should still be holding them in their current positions for another hour or 2 before it starts to break down. Should, Liam said. Should, I agreed. Now let's go. We went out at 22 past 9. The night was cold, which helped. Cold air slows chemical dispersal, giving the nodes longer effective windows. The cloud cover was heavy, and I couldn't see more than 30 feet. Good for concealment, bad for navigation. But we'd planned for it. Garrett, who knew every inch of the operational zone by feel, had walked each deployer's route twice that afternoon. I took Roy and the first node to the westernmost position, closest to the accumulation zone, highest risk. The logic being that if the highest risk position was mine, and it went wrong, the rest of the team wasn't leaderless in a general sense. They had a plan, they had their positions, they could still complete the operation. The west lot was 40 feet away when I placed the node. I could hear them, that ocean sound, as I've described it before. The collective noise of 40+ infected in a compressed space, closer than it should be. I went down to one knee, put the jar down, broke the inner seal with 2 fingers through the cloth wrapped around the base, set it open end down, and came back up. We moved. Over the radio, at intervals, I heard the other pairs checking in. Node 2 placed, Node 3 placed, Node 4 placed. A pause, 30 seconds, before Node 5. Cal's voice on the radio. Single contact, 15 meters north. Moving away. Node 5 placed. The specific relief of moving away. Node 6. Node 7. Node 8 was Finn, in the easternmost position, closest to the Clement corridor concentration. Silence on the radio. 40 seconds. 60. Nate's voice, carefully steady. Finn, status. 80 seconds. Node 8 placed, Finn said. Had a contact issue. Clear now. Moving to extraction. We extracted. All 8 deployers, both Overwatch pairs, to the staging point in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. 2 minutes before the hard cutoff. I stood at the staging point and listened. For about 3 minutes, nothing changed. The ocean sound from the west lot continued. The Clement corridor sounds faint at this distance, continued. Then, the west lot sound shifted. It's hard to describe a shift in an ambient noise pattern. It's more of a resolution than a distinct change. Like when you've been listening to a sound and not quite identifying it, and then something about it becomes recognizable. The collective shuffling of 40 infected in a lot moved from the omnidirectional sound of a milling group to something more directional, less consistent. The crowd was dispersing. Then the Clement corridor sounds. Same shift. The consistency breaking apart. Becca, on the radio. West lot movement. They're moving north. I count. I can't count exactly. It's too dark. But they're moving. Dispersing. Garrett. Clement corridor. Same. Movement north and south. Not toward us. Owen. From inside. What's the status? It's working, I said. The first indication that it wasn't over came 40 minutes later. We were at the staging point, waiting out the initial dispersal phase before we did an assessment sweep. The plan was working better than expected. The node chemistry was holding, and the infected were moving out of the critical zone in what Becca described as a wave pattern, pushing outward from the corridor between the two former accumulation points. Then the east secondary exit alarm went off. Not the wire cut alarm that was already disabled. The backup alarm Floyd had installed that afternoon. The tripwire at ankle height at the top of the secondary stairwell. It went off as a mechanical bell sound, carried down from the stairwell through the access corridor to the junction where Owen was sitting. Owen, on the radio. East secondary has been tripped. Someone on the stairs. I looked at Roy. Inside or outside? Has to be outside, Roy said. Stair access from the surface. The Shepherd's House group, Liam said. From my left. Or what's left of them, I said. The question was what they wanted. If they were trying to use the secondary access to get into the fortress while the infected situation was in flux, using the chaos they'd partly created as cover, they'd just found the stairwell locked at the lower landing by Cody's new bracing bars, and they'd tripped the alarm, and they were now in a narrow stairwell with no particular good options. Unless they'd also brought the child. I need 3 people at the east secondary, I said. Roy, Finn, and me. Everyone else hold positions. We moved. The east secondary stairwell exterior was set into the sidewalk behind the insurance building. A recessed hatch about the width of a single door. From the surface it looked like a utility access, which it was. The hatch was steel, latched from the inside through a cable mechanism I'd engineered, and it was closed. But not latched. Someone had come through. The latch mechanism was off its pin on the exterior latch. They'd opened it and gone down the stairs, and left it open. I looked at the open hatch, then at Roy. How many tripwires did Floyd set? 1, Roy said, at the top of the stairs. So they're at the bottom now, I said. At the brace door. I went down. Finn behind me. Roy at the top. The stairwell was 9 steps, concrete, narrow. At the bottom, a closed steel door, and, in front of it, in the thin light from above, 3 people. A man, a woman, and a child. The man had his hands up before I reached the bottom step. The woman was behind him, holding the child, and the child, 8 years old, maybe 9, was wrapped around her with both arms and had their face buried in her neck and wasn't making a sound. We don't, the man started. Not a sound, I said, not a shout, a statement of hard physical fact, not one more sound. He closed his mouth. I looked at them for a long moment in the near dark. You cut our alarm wire, I said. He nodded. You've been in this stairwell before. He nodded again. But you never came all the way in. We couldn't get through the door, he said, very quietly. Why are you here now? I said. A pause. The woman shifted the child slightly, and for the first time I saw the child's face. A girl, dark circles under her eyes, a cut on her chin from what looked like a fall. Her eyes were open. She was looking at me. The others, the man said, from our group. They found out we weren't. He stopped. Tried again. We weren't part of what they were planning. We found out about the infected operation, and we left. We had nowhere else to go. "The 6 of you from the shepherd's house," I said. 3 men, 2 women, 1 child. You said you left. Where are the other 4? Still out there. They're the ones doing this. His voice had the particular flatness of a person who has burned a bridge recently and can still see the smoke. They're the ones with the compounds. Not Dot's compounds. Their own. They've been setting it up for longer than you know. How long? I said. Since before we got to the distribution center. 2 months. They tracked your position from a drone survey. They had a drone. It was one of ours. We all came from Shepherd's house together, but they had it, and we didn't know what they were using it for until... He ran a hand over his face. Until we saw the map. What map? I said. He reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket. I tensed. He showed me. A folded piece of paper. He held it out. I took it, unfolded it. In the stairwell's low light, I couldn't read it fully, but I could see it was a hand-drawn site map. Our area, buildings marked, and 2 positions circled. One was the shell building above our fortress. The other was the distribution center. 2 targets. They planned to siege both sites, I said. Yes. And then take over the distribution center's inventory. Yes. Where's the rest of your group now? Roy said, from the top of the stairs. The man looked up at Roy. I don't know exactly, but they're out there somewhere, and they know your infected operation is working against their plan, and they're not going to just walk away. I stood very still and thought about that. 4 people, with their own chemical supply, and a plan that was being actively disrupted. Desperate people do specific things. They'll go manual, I said. Roy looked at me. If the chemical gradient isn't working, they'll try to drive the infected directly. Noise, direct stimulation, create a manual surge. Finn, from behind me, quietly. With 4 people and enough noise sources, they could trigger a significant group in a short time, I said, even without the pheromone approach. I looked at the man in front of me. Do they have communications with each other? 2-way radios, 3 of them. I had one. He patted his jacket. I gave mine to Dot's people. They can hear each other coordinating. They don't know I gave it away. What channel? He told me. I looked at the child. She was still watching me, very still. One hand gripping the woman's jacket collar. You're going to come inside, I said. This isn't a choice. I'm not leaving 3 people in this stairwell with what's developing outside. But I need to understand clearly, right now, whether there's anything else you haven't told me. The man and woman looked at each other. That specific look, the private communication of 2 people who've been through things together. There's one more thing, the woman said. It was the first time she'd spoken. Her voice was steadier than his. The shepherd's house. It's not just the 4 of them. They have a larger group about 8 miles north, maybe 40-50 people. This operation, if it fails, they won't just leave. I let that sit. They'll send more people. Yes, she said, to find out what happened. And to finish it. I turned and went back up the stairs. Roy looked at me. I handed him the map. He looked at it, looked up at me. This is a resource war, he said. Not an opportunistic attack. These people have been planning this. Yes. For 2 months. At least. Roy folded the map carefully and put it in his vest pocket. That changes what you can do about it. Yes, I said, it does. The next 40 minutes were the worst. I'll tell you that directly, because there's no useful way to describe those 40 minutes as anything other than what they were, which was controlled catastrophe. I had 3 people in the stairwell who needed to be brought inside and secured and assessed. I had 4 hostile operators somewhere in the operational zone who we now knew had radio coordination and at least a partial plan to go manual on infected stimulation. I had the dispersal operation still running, with the node chemistry doing its work, but with an unknown time window before degradation. I had Owen in the junction managing internal communications for a population of 73 people who had children and who were, as of 2 hours ago, locked down in an underground structure. And at 9 minutes past 10, Becca's voice came on the radio from the overwatch position, and her voice was not its usual carefully contained self. Derek. They're using noise sources. Clement and Fifth, east of Clement. I can hear. It sounds like they're banging on metal. It's the infected in the dispersed group from the north are turning. They're coming back around. How many? I said. I can't tell. It's dark, and they're coming from a sound on the radio that was outdoor wind and something else. Something low and rhythmic. There's more of them. They're attracting more from the north. I can see movement all the way down the block. Get inside, I said. Becca, get inside now. Garrett's still out. Garrett is with Cal on the west side, and they will reach the staging point. Get inside. A pause. Then, moving. Roy was already at the secondary exit top, reaching down to the 3 people in the stairwell. The man came up first, then lifted the child up toward Roy's hands. The woman came last. I looked at the 4 of them, Roy, the man, the woman, the child, in the open air behind the insurance building, and I heard the sounds from 3 blocks away. Not the ocean sound, something different. The sound of infected, that have been struck with a sudden strong stimulus and are moving toward it with the kind of rapid, disorganized urgency that a sudden sharp noise produces. 4 people with metal implements making noise. 40+ infected from the dispersed north group, possibly more from areas I hadn't tracked, being drawn back toward our zone. Move, I said. We made it to the secondary stairwell, and I pulled the hatch down and set the interior latch, just as the first infected reached the insurance building's exterior wall. I could hear them, the contact sounds, the scraping, against the building's east face, 8 feet above my head, moving past. The sound of the group was substantial, bigger than what had been in the west lot, bigger than I'd expected. Inside the stairwell, the child made no sound. That was the thing about her that I kept coming back to in the hours afterward. She was 8 or 9 years old, and she was in a narrow concrete stairwell, with strange adults, while dead people walked above her head, and she made no sound. I brought them through the lower landing door. Cody's bracing bars had to be removed from the inside by Owen, who was waiting, and into the Section A corridor, and I put them in the spare room next to the medical area and told Owen to stay with them. Then I went to the junction. Becca was inside. Garrett and Cal came in through the main gate at 10:05, which I didn't know until I was already at the junction because the main gate is a different entry, and I hadn't been monitoring it. Cody sealed the main gate as soon as they were through. All 8 deployers accounted for. Todd, Finn, and Bev, the distribution center people, were still inside because they'd come in through the secondary exit when the situation developed and hadn't been able to go back out. I noted this problem and filed it. I needed to get them home, and the only way was through a zone that was currently compromised. The current infected situation, from what Becca and Garrett had reported before they came in, and from the camera feeds that Owen was now monitoring at the junction, the north group that had been redispersed by our chemical operation had been re-stimulated and was returning south. The concentration in our immediate area was growing. On the camera, the street in front of the shell building, which the camera showed at an angle from the ventilation outlet, showed movement. Consistent movement. A lot of it. How many? I said to Owen. He was watching the monitor. I can't give you a count from this angle. The feed covers about 40 feet of street, and they're passing through it. 10, 15 I've counted so far, but they've been moving through for 4 minutes. 10 to 15 in 40 feet, passing through for 4 minutes. That was a large number. The structural integrity holds, I said. This was not optimism. This was engineering. The fortress had been designed with infected surge as an explicit scenario. The concrete and rebar of the parking structure could hold pressure loads far exceeding anything infected could exert. The gates were rated for it. The secondary exits were designed to be invisible at surface level. The infected could be on top of us for days and not get in. The risk was different. The risk was that the noise-making operators outside were going to drive the group around until they found something else to attract, like the distribution center, or until they ran out of time and the group dispersed naturally. The risk was that they'd also triangulate on any sound we made. The risk was the 3 unknown operators who had gotten to the east secondary before and who knew more about our layout than I was comfortable with. Noise discipline, I said, to the room. Everyone who isn't on essential communication, quiet. No movement in areas adjacent to the surface. Section C and D are fine. Section A reduces noise now. Word went through the structure in about 4 minutes. I'm proud of how fast that went. 2 years of training. 2 years of people understanding exactly why. The waiting was the next 4 hours. I'm not going to tell you every detail of the 4 hours, because much of it was controlled waiting, which is its own kind of difficulty, but not a dramatic one. What I want to tell you about is what happened at 2:17 in the morning. Roy, who had been watching the east secondary stairwell, came to the junction and said quietly, "Someone's at the hatch." The hatch I'd latched from the inside. Someone above it, trying the exterior latch. "Single contact," Roy said. "Possibly 2. I heard movement. No infected sounds from that direction." "How do you know it's not infected?" I said. Roy looked at me. "Infected don't try latches. They contact surfaces." This was a deliberate mechanical attempt. He was right. I knew he was right. It was one of the remaining operators, coming back to the access point they'd used before. "They won't get through," I said. "No, but they know we're here." They already knew we were here. They know we're inside. Active. Not cleared. Roy paused. "That's information that goes back to Shepard's house." "Yes," I said. 8 miles north. 40 to 50 people. "Yes." I thought about the map, the 2 circles, both targets. 4 operators running an infected management operation against 2 sites simultaneously. A larger group standing by to move in if the operation succeeded. What would a larger group do if the operation failed? Not walk away from 40 to 50 people's worth of resources sitting in a distribution center. Not with winter coming. Not with 2 years of desperation sharpening everybody's strategic thinking. "We have to make contact with Shepard's house before they send people," I said. Roy was quiet for a moment. "On what terms?" "Information exchange. We know their operation failed. We have 2 of their people. We have information about their chemical interference that we can prove. They might send people anyway." "They might. But if we reach out first, we control the framing. We're the ones who survived a siege attempt, who have information about their operation, who are holding 2 of their people, but who are also offering to talk instead of whatever else we might do." "What else might we do?" Roy said. "That's the part they don't know," I said, "which is exactly as much as I want them to know. Let me tell you about the morning after the siege, because it matters as much as the siege itself." At first light, 6 in the morning, Owen called me to the camera monitor. The street outside had cleared. The infected group that had been passing through our camera field since 10 the previous night had dispersed. Whether the chemical nodes had continued to function and pushed them away over the course of the night, or whether the manual noise-making operators had given up or moved away, and without fresh stimulation the group had dispersed naturally, I couldn't say. Both were possible. Both likely contributed. The street was empty. Not clean. There was debris, disrupted detritus on the pavement from the passage of a large number of infected through the area, but empty of the dead. I sent Liam out through the main gate at 6:15. Alone, which I don't like doing, but he's the best solo operator I have, and I needed eyes on the street quickly. He was back in 12 minutes with a verbal report, clear to 200 feet in each visible direction. The west lot was empty. The Clement corridor was empty. I opened the main gate at 6:30 and went out myself. The smell. There's a smell that large numbers of infected leave in a space where they've concentrated. It's an organic smell, rot-based, specific. We all know it by now. Standing in the street outside the Shell building at 6:30 in the morning, I could smell it clearly, which told me how many had been through here. More than the camera had shown. A lot more. And at the corner of the block, on the ground, one of our chemical nodes, intact, not deployed, still sealed, kicked or dragged from its position, presumably by the passage of infected. We'd placed 8, and this was the 3rd one I found in the wrong position on the morning sweep. The dispersal had been less complete than Becca's initial observation suggested, but it had been enough. Roy came out and stood next to me. We looked at the street. "We got lucky," he said. We had a plan, I said. Plans don't explain luck away. He was right about that too. The next week was one of the busiest I've had down here, which is saying something when every week is a full week. The 3 people from the stairwell, the man, the woman, the child, their names were Hank, Dot's opposite number in some respects, except his name was Kyle, and the woman was his wife Irene, different Irene from our nurse, to be clear. I'll call her Ira, going forward to avoid confusion, and the girl was their daughter, Lucy. Lucy, who had not made a sound in the stairwell, and who had sat in the spare room all night without complaint, and who, in the morning, asked Owen in a conversational tone whether he had anything to read. Owen gave her a stack of children's books from the Section C shelf, left there by a family who'd come through several months ago. She read 4 of them before lunch, and then found Holly in the corridor, and started asking her questions about the solar panel wiring, which is how I found them at 2 in the afternoon. Holly explaining photovoltaics to a 9-year-old with a patience and clarity that told me something about Holly I hadn't fully appreciated yet. Kyle told me everything he knew about Shepard's house over the course of 2 days' worth of conversations at the junction table. He confirmed the numbers: 46 people, 8 miles north, in a complex of interconnected buildings that had originally been an assisted living facility. The buildings were solid, brick construction, 5 stories, and they'd been fortifying them since early in the outbreak. Leadership, a man named Boyd. Kyle described him in the specific way that someone describes a person they've been afraid of for a long time, not dramatically, not with hatred, but with a careful flatness that was its own testimony. Boyd was smart. Boyd had organizational capacity. Boyd had been moving Shepard's house from a survival posture to an expansion posture for the past year, and the distribution center operation was the first in what he apparently planned as a series of acquisition moves. He'll know the operation failed, Kyle said. He'll know by now. How long before he sends someone, I said. He won't send someone immediately. He'll reassess, maybe 2 weeks. And then, something different, something bigger. Kyle looked at his hands. He doesn't have chemistry like Dot's man. The pheromone system, our group figured it out, and Dot figured it out independently. Boyd used what we had. He doesn't have anyone with that background. So whatever he sends next is more conventional. He has vehicles, Kyle said. Heavy vehicles. A backhoe, an armored truck from a private security company that came through their area early on. If he decides to, he stopped. If he decides to come in force, he's not going to be subtle. I thought about that. Would he really commit a significant force from a community of 46 people to a takeover operation 8 miles from home? Kyle looked at me. He already tried it with 4 people and a 2-month pheromone campaign. Point taken. The radio contact with Shepard's house happened on a Tuesday. We'd intercepted their radio channel, the one Kyle had given us, and monitored it for 4 days before transmitting. What we heard on that channel was sparse. Occasional check-ins in a simple code that we broke in about a day. The 4 operators had made it back to Shepard's house by the morning after the siege. We knew this because on that morning, there was a single exchange in the code, brief, that decoded to something approximately meaning, returned, operation unsuccessful. Boyd himself came on the channel on the 4th day of our monitoring. He didn't use the code, which either meant he didn't care who was listening, or he wanted to make a point. To whoever is in the underground structure at the construction site, he said, "My name is Boyd Reeves. I believe you have 2 of my people. I'd like to discuss their return." I sat at the radio with Owen standing behind me. "He's offering a trade," Owen said quietly. "He's establishing contact," I said. "And he's showing us he knows exactly where we are, and that he's been thinking about us." "You going to answer?" "Yes," I said, "on my terms." I picked up the radio. "This is Derek Paulson. You can call me Derek. We have Kyle and Irene and their daughter. They're safe. They asked to stay, not to be exchanged. I'm open to a conversation about the situation between our communities, but not a transaction about people." A pause, longer than you'd expect. Then Boyd's voice. "I respect that position. What kind of conversation did you have in mind? The kind where both sides come to the table with what they actually want, instead of what they think they can take," I said. We know about the operation your people ran. We know the scope of it. We're not interested in holding that over you. We're interested in understanding what you actually need, and whether there's a way to meet those needs that doesn't involve pointing infected at people's homes. Another pause. Shorter this time. You're direct, Boyd said. It's a direct situation. I have 46 people, he said. Winter is 5 months out. We have a building and a food situation that is, a pause, less stable than I'd like. We have a similar food situation, I said, which is why 2 groups fighting over the same resource area is bad for both of us. The distribution center has a group in it with a chemistry system that makes infected management dramatically more effective, I said. That's worth more than the supplies it's sitting on. If you take the building, you lose the system. You work with the people in it, you get both. A long pause. You've been talking to them, Boyd said, for a week, and they sent you to negotiate. Nobody sent me, I said. I'm telling you what I see as the rational structure of the situation. You can respond to that or not. Owen, behind me, made a quiet sound that I interpreted as approval. From Owen, that's about as expressive as it gets. Boyd said, I'd want a face-to-face meeting. So would I said. Neutral location. I'll suggest 3. You pick one. The meeting happened 12 days after the siege. Neutral location. A fire station 2 miles from the distribution center, equidistant from both our position and the assisted living complex. It had a large apparatus bay, with good visibility in all directions, and multiple exits, which meant both sides could position observers without disadvantage. I didn't assume the meeting would go well enough that the observers would be unnecessary. I just didn't want them to be needed. I brought Roy, Nate, and Dot. Dot bringing her presence to the table was a signal. It said the distribution center and the fortress were treating this as a joint concern, which was true, and which would be clearest if demonstrated rather than stated. Boyd brought 3 people, one of whom was the man who'd been in the 4-person operation team. He didn't introduce this person by name, and nobody mentioned it. Boyd Reeves was 50-something, heavy-set, with the kind of posture that says a person has been physically confident all their life. He had an organized quality. Everything about him, from his clothes to his bearing, said that he was a person who controlled his environment, which I recognized as the quality of a manager. Not necessarily a leader, but a manager. The distinction matters. Managers maintain systems. Leaders create them and modify them when the system is wrong. I wasn't sure Boyd knew the difference. The meeting was 4 hours. I'll spare you the full transcript. It was not dramatic in the way you might expect. It was, for long sections, exhausting. Boyd wanted things stated and restated and confirmed. He had a lawyer's instinct for pinning down specifics, which told me he'd probably been in business before, some kind of property or finance field. He kept coming back to the inventory question, the distribution center's supplies, how they'd be allocated. Dot handled that part. She'd been in communication with me for a week, and she'd come to her own conclusions about what she was willing to offer, which turned out to be shared access to the pheromone management system in exchange for mutual defense agreements and established supply-sharing protocols. Not a merger, not a subordination, a treaty. Boyd didn't love the word treaty. It implied equality. We have 46 people, he said, the 4th time the allocation question came up, and the resources to defend a significantly larger area than either of your communities currently controls. You have 46 people and an armored truck, Roy said, from the corner where he'd been sitting. We have a fortified underground structure, a functional chemical system for infected management, and current information about every infected concentration within 2 miles of the central area. The question isn't who has more. It's whether what each side has is more useful together or apart. Boyd looked at Roy for a long moment. You're the numbers man, he said. Claims adjuster, Roy said. Boyd made a sound that was almost amusement. What do you think the claim value is here? Depends on what you're claiming, Roy said. And somehow that was the moment the meeting turned. I don't know exactly why. Something about Boyd recognizing a particular kind of mind across the table from him. The kind that doesn't inflate or deflate, but just calculates. He sat back in his chair, and something in him reset. "What's the proposal?" he said. To me, not Roy, acknowledging that I'd been running this from the start. Phase 1. Immediate cessation of any infected management operations that affect either of our zones without prior coordination. You, Dot's team, and my team establish a shared radio channel and a weekly coordination meeting. Phase 2. We bring your agricultural and building expertise, I understand you have construction-capable people, into a joint expansion of the fortress. More capacity means fewer resource pressures for everyone. Phase 3. Supply sharing on a formula we agree on in Phase 1, based on actual inventory on both sides, audited jointly. You want to audit my inventory, Boyd said. I want to build trust, I said. Auditing inventory is one way to do it. You audit ours too. A pause. What happens to the 4 operators who ran the pheromone operation? They come back to your community, I said. That's between you and them. We're not interested in punishment. We're interested in the future arrangement. Kyle and his family. Their choice. They've indicated they want to stay with us. We'll respect whatever they decide. Boyd was quiet for almost a minute. I let it be quiet. The apparatus bay of the fire station had been full of light all afternoon, and now, at 4 o'clock, the light was going amber and horizontal, cutting under the bay doors in long strips across the concrete floor. 30 days, Boyd said finally. Phase 1 for 30 days. If it holds, we talk about Phase 2. That's reasonable, I said. And if it doesn't hold, Boyd said, looking at me with the specific expression of a person saying the thing they've been building to, you'll need to tell me now what you're prepared to do, because I need to know the alternative. I looked at him. The alternative is that we document everything that happened with the pheromone operation. Everything we know about Shepherd's House's current resources and location, and we spend the next 6 months building our own coalition with every survivor group in a 10-mile radius. We don't need to fight you. We just need to be better connected than you. A very long pause. Boyd nodded. Once, 30 days. 30 days passed. Then 30 more. The joint radio channel had its first incident in week 2. One of Shepherd's House's scouts moved into our operational zone without notification, and we nearly had a confrontation at the Clement corridor that Roy diffused by being on the radio before anyone did anything irreversible. Boyd sent a formal acknowledgement of the breach and we accepted it and moved on. The chemical system coordination was more successful than I'd expected. Dot and Glenn shared the core formulation with a Shepherd's House resident named Hank, a different Hank from our Kyle, which created some confusion before we started calling the new Hank by his full name, Hank Deering, who turned out to have an agricultural chemistry background and who took the system apart and rebuilt it with improvements within a month. The combined system, running from 3 points rather than 1, could now manage infected movement across a zone nearly 4 times the size of what Dot had been covering alone. This changed our operational environment in ways that are hard to overstate. The nights got quieter. The runs got shorter. The accumulations that had been our constant maintenance concern, the reason we went out every night, started to thin. Not disappear, but thin. Boyd came to the fortress in month 2. Just him and 2 others. He stood in the main junction and looked at the structure and didn't say anything for almost a full minute. You built this, he said, finally. Not a question. With help, I said. No. He looked at the ceiling, at the column system, at the electrical runs and the ventilation ducts. You built this. I didn't argue the point. He brought 6 construction-experienced people from Shepherd's House into the expansion project. We'd been planning expansion, a 4th wing off the drainage tunnel section, additional capacity for 30 more people, additional cistern volume, a dedicated workshop space that Nate had been wanting since the beginning. 6 more bodies with construction skills was the difference between a 12-month project and a 5-month one. We broke ground, or rather, we broke concrete, in month 3 of the agreement. The sound of drilling and pouring in the deep section became the constant background noise of the fortress for weeks, which was its own kind of strangeness, and the children in Section C found it fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Holly spent most of the expansion phase working alongside Floyd on the electrical extension. She didn't need to be asked. She just started showing up where the work was. By month 4, I'd given her a specific scope of her own, the lighting system for the new wing, and she executed it with the particular combination of competence and controlled intensity that good young engineers have before the world has a chance to sand the edges off them. I told her that once, sort of sideways, not in a way that was intended to be a compliment. She gave me a look that said she'd already decided not to let the world sand her down, and she'd appreciate it if I kept my observations to myself. Lucy, Kyle's daughter, had by this point essentially adopted Owen as a kind of surrogate uncle, which Owen was completely unprepared for and completely accepted. She sat next to him at the junction every morning while he did his first communications checks, drinking a diluted version of the instant coffee that he would not stop giving her, no matter how many times Ira pointed out the caffeine issue. She was 10 now, or close to it. She asked questions about everything. Where do the dead go when they fall? Why does concrete cure and not dry? What did the city sound like before? Owen answered everything she asked, in the flat, complete way that Owen answers things. And I think it was the best thing for both of them. The radio signal we found was in the 5th month after the agreement. Nate found it. He was doing his regular monitoring of the communication channels. We listened to the spectrum the way early sailors listened to weather, as a matter of routine, and in the 2 to 4 megahertz range, at a frequency nobody in our operating coalition used, there was a signal. Regular, timed, repeating at 4-hour intervals. Not a distress signal. Distress signals have a particular cadence that every surviving human on the planet has learned by now. This was different. This was coded. Short sequences of tones, not voice, just tones, in a pattern that repeated with very minor variations. Nate spent 3 days on it before bringing it to me. He brought a notebook full of transcribed sequences and sat across from me at the junction table and said, "I can't decode this. I don't know the key, but I can tell you what it's not." "What it's not," I said. "It's not distress. It's not a standard survival beacon. It's not radio weather or military protocols from before. I've compared the formats, and it doesn't match any of them. It's not random. What is it? Something regular and intentional being sent by someone who knows how to encode information and expects someone to decode it." I looked at the notebook. The patterns were there in Nate's careful handwriting, sequences of numbers representing the tones, at regular intervals, for 68 hours of monitoring. "The range," I said, "for a signal this consistent at this frequency, at minimum several hundred miles, possibly more." I thought about that. Several hundred miles, beyond our territory, beyond our coalition, beyond anything we'd been thinking about. The world as we'd experienced it had compressed to a manageable radius, and here was a signal from somewhere outside that radius, saying something we couldn't read. "Boyd knows about radio," I said. "Boyd has someone who was a ham radio operator before," Nate said. "I know because they contributed 3 components to our receiver setup in month 2. Let's bring him in on this." Boyd's radio person was a woman named Vivian who came to the fortress 2 days later with a card index of radio protocols and a manner that was all technical precision and no personal information. She listened to the recorded sequences for 2 hours and made notes and then looked at us. "Government," she said. "Government is gone," I said. "Government infrastructure doesn't have to be," she said. "This is a format that was developed for continuity of operations communications. Emergency broadcast backbone, not the consumer-facing emergency alert system. This is the back end, the part that was always meant to keep working when everything else stopped." "Who would be sending it?" Nate said. "Someone with access to an operational transmitter and the key to encode this protocol. Continuity of government bunkers, emergency operations centers, military facilities with subterranean power. Or someone who figured out the format," Roy said, from his position at the edge of the room. Vivian looked at him. "Possible, less likely." "What are they saying?" I said. "I don't have the key," she said. "But I can tell you the structure. It's a repeating beacon with variation. The variation carries information. The base signal says, 'I am here. I am operational.' The variation says, Here are the specifics. Coordinates, Nate said. Among other things, Vivian said. Yes. We looked at each other. They're telling people where they are, I said. And asking people to come, Vivian said. Or at minimum, to acknowledge. The room was quiet for a long time. I thought about what we'd built here. 63 feet underground, the water cisterns and the food ledger and the column inspection routine, the chemical management system, the coalition, the children in Section C, Lucy reading about photovoltaics at age 10, Holly running electrical in the new wing, Owen with his flat answers and his coffee, Roy watching from corners, calculating claims. All of it assembled, piece by piece, in the specific way that engineered structures are assembled. A foundation first, then what the foundation can bear, then what that structure can bear on top of it. Not heroism, not luck, not a plan that survived contact with reality intact. A continuous, imperfect, adaptive process of figuring out what was broken and fixing it and figuring out what would break next. I thought about 8 miles north, where 46 people had chosen to try violence first, and were now, 5 months into this new arrangement, learning that they got more from coordination. Most of them. And I thought about whatever was sending this signal from somewhere several hundred miles away, patient and regular, saying, I am still here. Can we respond? I said. We'd need to build a transmitter capable of reaching that distance, Vivian said. It's doable. It would take time and the right components. What would we need? She thought about it. 6 to 8 weeks. Specific components from the right sources. Some of it is in my parts inventory. Some of it I'd need. What sources? I said. She gave me a list. I read it. Half the items on the list were plausible, things we could find in our operational area with the right approach. The other half were more challenging. But challenging and impossible were two different things. And I'd been solving challenging engineering problems in bad conditions for 2 years. 6 weeks, I said. If the components are findable, yes. Put together a proper component spec, I said. With tolerances and alternatives where substitution is possible. I'll work the supply plan. I could feel the room's energy shift. Not excitement exactly. Something more careful than excitement. The energy of people who have survived long enough to understand that new possibilities are also new risks, and who are still willing to move toward them. This could be nothing, I said. To be honest about it, it could be a government remnant that's unstable. It could be someone who decoded the protocol for their own purposes. It could be a long way from here and unreachable in any practical sense. It could also be something, Nate said. Yes, I said. It could, Roy said, from his corner. The assessment on that depends on what we find when we decode the variation sequence. Yes, I said. So that's the first task. Decode it. Vivian tapped her notepad. I'll need access to the transmission records. 68 hours of data, you said. Nate has it all. And I'll need something else, she said. I'll need to run something that's going to seem like a very long shot. What? I said. There are other continuity of operations frequencies besides this one. If someone is using this protocol, they might be using others. I want to do a full spectrum survey, see what else is out there. I nodded. Set it up. The transmitter project is ongoing. I want to be clear about that because I don't want to give you the impression that this is resolved in a way that things don't get resolved. It isn't. We're in the middle of it. We've found 5 of the 8 required components. The 6th is in a building 6 miles from here that has a significant infected concentration. Dot's team has been running management gradients in the area for 3 weeks now, working the concentration down to a level where a retrieval run is feasible. Maybe another 2 weeks. The 7th and 8th components are more of a problem. Vivian says she can substitute for one of them with items from Boyd's parts inventory, which Boyd has agreed to contribute on the basis of the agreement. The agreement is holding, which is the most important thing I can tell you about the current state of affairs between our communities. That the agreement is holding, and people on both sides are acting inside it, rather than around it. The 8th component I don't have a clear plan for yet. I'm working on it. The signal continues to transmit. Every 4 hours, regular as a clock, from somewhere we can't yet name. We've collected 412 hours of it now. Vivian has made progress on the variation sequence. She's identified what she believes is a directional element, which would narrow the origin to a sector rather than just a general distance. She hasn't confirmed it. We've also found 2 other signals on adjacent frequencies. Fainter, different cadences. Something is active out there, beyond our operational horizon, and we don't know what it is. I'll be honest with you about what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid that whatever is sending these signals is something genuinely organized, not a small survivor group, not a community of 46 people in an assisted living building. Something with real infrastructure, real range, real capability. And I don't know yet whether something like that, encountered from our position, would be a rescue or a threat. The thing about being an engineer is that you build what you can build, and you plan for what you can anticipate, and you try to design redundancy into the systems that matter most. You cannot design for perfect safety. You can design for adequate resilience. You can build something that will fail in predictable ways when it fails, rather than catastrophic ones. We've built that. This fortress, this specific collection of tunnels and cisterns and LED lights and welded gate frames, and a kitchen that Owen is always in too early, is a resilient structure. It will survive what I know how to prepare it for. What I can't yet see coming from 8 or 10 or 200 miles away. That's the engineering problem that's keeping me awake on the nights when the bunk is in the right rotation and I'm looking at the junction box on the wall. That's the next project. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'm going to stop, because this account has gone on long enough and there's work to do. 3 days ago I went down to Section D, the deep section, lowest level, 45 feet below grade, where the ceiling is so low that tall people have to be careful and where it always smells like wet clay. I brought a flashlight and a pocket knife. On the load-bearing column where I kept my tally, 4 in a diagonal, 4 in a diagonal, I found the last mark, day 240, roughly, 8 months in. I stood there for a while. The clay smell, the hum of the earth around me, the very faint sound, if you hold your breath, of the structure doing what structures do, holding weight, distributing load, flexing imperceptibly against the ground it's set in. I put the tip of the knife against the concrete. I thought about what mark to make. A single line didn't mean enough anymore. 2 years isn't a number that means what it used to mean on a tally. Numbers for individual days had stopped mattering. I made a mark that wasn't on the tally system. It was a letter, an A, the beginning of something, which is the only thing that makes sense to mark down here, in the foundation of a structure that is still being built. Then I went back up to the junction. Owen was there. "Sleep?" he said. "Enough," I said. He poured me a cup of coffee. Outside, somewhere above us, the street was empty in the early morning. The chemical gradients were holding the infected at distance. The signal was transmitting from wherever it was transmitting from. The new wing was half-framed. Holly's lighting system was already installed in 2 of the 4 new sections. Lucy was asleep in Section C, in a bunk next to her parents, with a photovoltaics diagram she'd drawn herself, folded under her pillow like a kid who's been told to put away a book before lights out. I drank the coffee,